right, we are here. This is Joe Moore, CEO, co-founder of Psychedelics. Today, we're joined by David Aronson. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks. I'm David Aronson. I'm really happy to be here and talking to you.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. We got a chance to link up at a recent conference. Was that at Remind?
That was at Remind at MJ BizCon, yeah.
That's right. Oh, that makes a lot of sense why you were there. Actually, I get
Yeah,
it now.
yeah.
I I I never. I know the whole point is to have people from cannabis come over to psychedelics, but I like never piece it together when I'm chatting with folks that they're there for cannabis reasons
I
primarily
don't.
often.
I think there's a lot of crossover. Honestly, I think it's just weirdly siloed. I think that, yeah, I think It's interesting that they're separated somewhat.
hmm It's fun. I've had a good time being involved with Remind for the last few years, and I hope we can keep it going. It's neat to have that kind of cannabis bridge and the back and forth flow a bit too.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, so we chatted back then because you had a really interesting meeting in
I
Boston.
did.
Let's not share too much, but share
Yeah.
whatever you feel like you want to.
No. I just so I'll just share briefly that cannabis education over the last few years has kind of gone through a journey. And I've seen it change a lot. Well, my program is stayed mostly the same, but I update it with information as I can. But what I've noticed is that at first there's this emphasis of cannabinoids separated from cannabis, and then this sort of movement back towards the whole plant, understanding that there's different applications there and different outcomes. But what I've noticed in all the places is there's just kind of is everybody in the room agreeing with each other, which felt good when you're there. But then when you go back from these conferences and try to make things happen, it's sort of like nothing's changed that much because you just kind of everybody pat each other on the back and like, we feel really good about what we're doing. This is great. See you later. And then recently I went to Boston to this interesting conference called the CB1, CB2 Drug Development Conference that was focused on drug development of this receptor set. So it's kind of a different angle. And so I was very excited to go and learn some new stuff, which I did very much so. But also what I really learned is that there's just this giant knowledge gap all the way up the chain in the pharmaceutical industry. And it's like there's some that seem to know, but they obfuscate things. And then there's some that just don't know. And then there's also this role in the cannabis sort of research body of sort of, I don't know how to explain it. It's just like a rigidity to not open up, I guess, to some other ways of thinking. So what I'd like to see and what I want to try to do over the next year is bring cannabis presentations to like non-cannabis focused conferences. So like looking at, psychopharmacology conferences and talking about cannabis in the realm of psychopharmacology rather than talking about psychopharmacology as it applies to cannabis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that's great. Like there is obviously big interest in these receptor sites, and you shared some really interesting stories with me the other day, and maybe that's where we start. So let's maybe rewind the tape. Like how did the idea that these things could be medically appropriate like come to mind for you? Like cannabis
Well,
like usually just has such like a dirty rap, and
so I grew up
yeah.
in Maine, right? Sorry, I interrupted you there, but like this, like I know the course of this answer, so I sorry, I get a little impatient. Yeah, I grew up in Maine. Maine has double the national average of people that use cannabis, or at least admitted on surveys, right? And so I grew up knowing my dad used to use a lot of cannabis, and he told me very early on, for some people it's a medicine, but like anything else, everything in moderation. So that was just a lesson I always put in my head about anything. But I also grew up, in high school and stuff here, and everybody, well, all my friends smoke pot, and that's what we would kind of do for fun. There's not always a lot to do in a rural place, and so I grew up experiencing it in a non-negative way. I never really saw people hurt by it. That's not to say that it can't happen, but the harm, if you look at studies, harm caused by cannabis is generally by definitional, like because it's a crime, then there are negative outcomes associated with its criminality rather than its actual use. And so I did see that growing up. I did have friends get kicked out of school, things like that. I was just one of those kids that never got caught. I was smart about things, I guess, or dumb, depending on how you look at it. But when I got into my work as a clinician, as I told you, I did spend some time in my 20s entrepreneurially involved in cannabis, and ironically was able to support myself for the first time for several years, completely independently, but very isolated. And then I went back to school for social work because I wanted to become a counselor, because I saw it as a career path. Both my parents were clinical psychologists. I thought I was really into filmmaking and art. I thought, oh, here's a career I can work not a ton of hours and pursue the stuff I really like in my free time. That's kind of how it turned out, but it didn't end up being film in the end. So I would interview people for, so my first job as a clinician was the practice I worked for had this funnel where the wait list is so long for psychiatry that what they would do is they'd have clinicians do the initial psychosocial assessment to connect you with a therapist. And if it went well, could start therapy right away. And so that usually was better outcomes, kind of guiding people into psychiatry, could do a lot of priming. So I would ask people, do you use alcohol or drugs part of the regular assessment? No. I'd say, well, do you smoke pot? Sometimes they'd say yes. Sometimes they'd say no. I'd say, really? Never? And sometimes they'd say, well, sometimes. Sometimes they'd say no. And if they said no, I'd say, you never tried it, really? And then sometimes they'd say, well, I did once and it didn't, I had a bad experience. Or even sometimes they'd say no. And I'd say, really? That's so rare growing up in Maine. And then they would still say, well, yeah, all my friends did and my family. So it was that I had done a lot of sales work in college. I was actually a Kirby vacuum salesman. I was #1 in New England. And they wanted me to drop out of college and open my own shop. But I learned that, a no is not a no until you hear it 3 times. And I took that to heart. I saw a lot of parallels with sales and therapy, actually, because you're telling somebody on themselves. You're trying to get them to believe that they're good enough.
Yeah.
Because my couple decades of being a therapist, what I really realized is that people's #1 problem is thinking that there's something wrong with them, generally speaking. That's not always the case, but it's a rule of thumb for most people. And that your job is to get them to believe that they're good enough in this world. And so there's a lot of parallels there. So I would draw out a lot of people. And if I'd ask them, do you ever partake in marijuana cigarettes? It'd just be a no. And so it's the way I asked too was really comfortable. And that's another thing I learned, where if you want an answer to something, you have to actually ask it. Because one time I forgot to ask if somebody had a criminal history. At the end, I asked, is there anything I forgot to ask? Is, well, I did rob a bank once. I said, oh, that seems relevant. Thank you. Forgot that section on the form. So I just took on a really direct style with my clients and I got them to open up about their use. And most people would tell me it was really helpful for them. It helped them sleep. It helped with their pain. And now as things progressed, I think I told you I had developed Lyme disease. And so I learned a lot about that and its nature. It's neuropsychiatric presentations where if it's not treated well enough, or it's undertreated or not treated at all, it very commonly leads to neuropsychiatric presentations. And it's very complicated because it's less commonly just one infection, but that's another story. We'll just call it Lyme for now. But that seizure disorders with no known etiology was a weirdly common thing, but should be rare. So that, and people would use cannabis for that. And so then I also had psychiatrist asked me to research about head injuries because I shared a client she was very concerned about. And in my research, I went back to her and I said, I don't know how to tell them to not use cannabis because everything I find says cannabis is good for people with head injuries. And so,
Mm-hmm.
that really just led me down a path. And some of the early pioneers like Dustin Sulak were in Maine. I would just see the certificates and just took it upon myself to get really well educated. And then I had an experience at a continuing education seminar in 2018 where I just kept raising my hand and correcting the poor man. I really gave him a hard time, but he was wrong. And it's like, you can't just be telling people things that are wrong. And that's when I realized, oh, I could be doing this. And so I started doing it in various states across the country just before COVID, and kind of been doing it here and there since. Find some of my previous recordings on Pessy. Got some other live events coming up that I'll share information about that later if you want. But just say now before I forget, January 28th and February 11th, I'll be posting on LinkedIn and stuff like that. So yeah. I'll be doing them getting back on track to doing them monthly now, which is exciting. So yeah, that's kind of how I came into it. And also getting very sick myself. So when I was at my sickest, I was just taking on a professional career, professional license. I really wasn't using cannabis, and I was becoming sicker and sicker. I developed neurological symptoms, back pain. I probably always had ADD, but it became really pronounced and sort of getting in my way of doing things. I wasn't able to complete my notes and all this sort of stuff. I started taking stimulants, sleep meds, pain meds, anti-anxiety meds. I never had a problem with any of them per se, other than I didn't really feel better. And I was able to stop once I got my proper diagnosis. I went on antibiotics and I stopped taking all those and just used cannabis as symptomatic treatment ever since. And after lots of rounds of treatment, I've been in a fair amount of remission from where I was before. It relapses and remits, but it's really kept at bay. It's surprising.
That's fascinating. Is there so I assume you're, pretty fluent on the Lyme's topic. Do we have kind of a decent understanding of Lyme's at this point in early 2025?
All the information's out there. The problem is the disseminating bodies like the CDC and the International Infectious Disease Society, the people that put out the protocols and sort of the official information, they're very behind the science and has been for a long time. The reasons for that are really complicated. If people want to really get a good understanding of that, I would suggest the documentary Under Our Skin. It's available, I think, for free on YouTube and on Amazon. And there's a sequel where everybody gets better because it's incredibly depressing. The sequel is called Emergence. But yeah, it explains well that there's a real kind of controversy and conspiracy around Lyme that doesn't help anybody that has it, but it does explain a bit why there's this great lack of knowledge. People that want to know more about alternate protocols that have better evidence backing, I look at ILADS, the International Lyme and Associated Disease Society. They even have a Find a Doctor page for people that are sick. Also looking at your local Lyme disease support network and asking for help. But it's so prevalent, I think, is really the issues. The World Health Organization just studied a few years ago where 15% of the world's population will likely test positive for Lyme antibodies, meaning they've been exposed to it at some point in their life. And where I live is the highest per capita in the world, actually. The county and area I'm in even.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
We brought our little puppy back a while ago, and she tested positive for antibodies somewhat recently, and it's really crazy. I've never been tested. I used to, this is a little gross, but just the amount of ticks that I used to have on me growing up in New Hampshire is just mind-boggling.
Did you learn to burn them off with a paper clip?
Oh, thank God,
That's what we
no.
did when I was a kid. Is get that paper clip red hot and kill the thing while it's still on you. It was just like the worst thing you could do.
My mother's a nurse, so we we followed a certain protocol that she had for us.
She probably much better.
Yeah, and I've had friends with Lyme's, and it's like a pretty debilitating situation. And
Yeah.
I remember this one situation where a friend he had it, and he had a job doing like tour guiding on boats, and he got cooked in the sun. And I don't know if it was from Lyme's itself or the antibiotics, but it was just not okay.
The
Um,
doxycycline actually, if he was on doxycycline, that does cause you can get sun damage from that. But
yeah,
the
that
heat
makes sense.
intolerance is a big part of it for sure. Yeah,
Hmm.
it just causes your immune system to get all out of whack, basically. So all
Okay.
these, what's fascinating crossover with cannabis is Lyme can be a potential cause of rheumatoid, MS,
Mm.
ALS, Parkinson's. All crips, all the things that all these sort of difficult syndromes that cannabis is really well known for treating are Lyme is a potential cause of. It's not always the cause of MS, but it certainly can be. It's not uncommon. And same thing with Parkinson's and ALS. That sometimes when people, like I once had a client who lived with a Parkinson's diagnosis, was treated for years, then finally got this newer test that actually tested dopamine levels like somehow more accurately, and it turned out she did not have Parkinson's, and she got Lyme tested for Lyme. She had Lyme. When I she stopped having Parkinsonian syndromes. So it's just it's really wild stuff. But it in the American Psychiatric Association's guidelines
Hmm.
for a diagnosis, ruling out medical etiologies, Lyme is specifically mentioned in the
Mm.
guidelines. Lyme disease is
Mm.
specifically mentioned, and it's still not a part of the regular workup for psychiatry.
So we had a question. Yeah, thanks for that. That's interesting. So we had a question from Instagram
Mhm.
asking about the term priming you used earlier. Do you recall the
Mm.
context in which you used priming earlier?
Um, I did, yeah. Oh, yes. So, talking about getting people ready for psychiatry. So, like, if I've got a client who has psychotic symptoms and I know they're gonna need some medication or something like
Mm.
that, then you can prime them and get them ready for that sort of process and talk to them about risks and stuff like that, and give them some CBT skills. Just kind of prime them for the process and the changes that are
Mm. Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So priming can be used a lot of
coming.
ways
Yeah, yeah,
in this
it's a
time
loaded
in these
term. I realize. Yeah,
discussions.
yeah.
Yeah. But cool. Yeah. Thanks for that. And it seems like we have a lot of people interested in this topic, which is
Hmm.
lovely.
Cool.
So uh, you were doing kind of CE based ed around these topics for a little while. Like
Mhm.
what kind of reception did you have from clinicians who you were in conversation with?
Just overwhelmingly positive. Honestly, the people that would come to my talks, was fascinating. When I first started advertising in Ohio and Florida, I got like death threats from social workers. People would write back to me with the worst, most foul language. How dare you try to sell drugs in our community? And I would just write back like, I don't appreciate your tone. Please do not continue to communicate with me this way, or I'll report you to your board. Never hear from them again. But yeah, I would get like threatening emails from mental health clinicians because these are the only people I was emailing at first.
What do you think was going on there? Like, why do you think they were feeling so threatened?
Just the anti-drug sentiment in general. I think that there's still a very strong contingent of people who just don't trust that cannabis can be a medicine. And it's I heard a really interesting talk. There's this guy I like a lot that always see at conferences, Preston Campbell, and
Mm.
we had this talk about FDA approval for psychedelics and stuff, and just mentioned that the average age of your FDA employee is like in the 60s. They're in their 60s, and so there's a saying: "Science moves along one funeral at a time." And so we're in a state where the people retiring or entering that stage, some of them just can't really be reached in a sense, or they won't let themselves. It's you know, it's, in a lot of ways, it's like religion. Beliefs are, I think, with physicians and stuff. I think it comes some of it's self-protective, because that they admit that cannabis is a good medicine, then that means they've been preventing people from helping themselves and maybe causing them harm by prescribing other regimens like opiates. I only ever heard one medical professional say that at a talk once in Cannabis Science Conference in Providence. This nurse, I wish I could remember her name to give her credit. She's really brave for saying it, just saying how much she regretted prescribing and recommending opiates over the years when she was told that cannabis was not an effective pain medicine.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's part of it, is that you'd have to do a lot of, you know, sort of acceptance of things. I think that's difficult for some people.
It is. Yeah. You had a really great story too about Rick Simpson oil and cancer.
Yeah.
Which we've heard endless kind of testimony about this. I've not seen any data, but let's hear your story.
So, I mean, the Rick Simpson story is fascinating in general. I always tell it in my talk, just how this guy is so cavalier with his own medical care. It's just wild. Like, I'm going to do this thing nobody's done before and not listen to anybody, and it worked. But the whole, the Rick Simpson oil, you know, kind of going along this whole plant avenue. Over the years, there's a producer that I've kind of partnered with in a way. So like, if I have any disclosures, it would be around both the Standard Seed Corporation that I'm doing marketing and sales for, that we'll touch on, but also I've been consulting for a long time with this outfit called Real Cannabis Medicine Co. If you want to check out their website, it's realcannabismedicineco.com. And what this guy has done over the years is, through patient feedback only, has tweaked his medicine and formula over the years to where he's actually created symptom-specific formulas where it's whole plant. He uses the roots, leaves, everything, all of it. His method preserves a lot of non-cannabinoid components that even traditional Rick Simpson oil would cut out. So the high heat of decarboxylation will sometimes remove things like flavonoids, and those have very strong anti-cancer, anti-inflammatory properties, at least in the petri dishes. There's a couple companies, ourselves included, researching those properties. And so he's developed this method of producing powderized RSO and a protocol that goes along with it. And that's what's been so fascinating to me, is that, you know, everybody will say take RSO and take as much as you can, as little time as you can, but that's not really a protocol. So there's few doctors out there that I've heard of that will do this, like Dr. Sulak or Bonnie Goldstein will have actual protocols, but it's difficult. And so he's really incredible in that he's what he's essentially devised people do is he's got these capsules, and you just basically take one every hour, every 2 hours, until you're kind of sleeping more of the day than not. And my own father, this last spring, developed stage 4 metastatic prostate cancer, and he's 81 years old. And when I dug into his lab reports, and I reached out to all my connections, I had heads of departments reviewing his stuff, and they all said, you know, he should be doing this pretty severe treatment, and, you know, he should be talking about when, not if, this is going to be the thing that ends his life. And so I immediately got him on these capsules, and he really fought the protocol because he didn't want to sleep. He was so afraid of sleeping away the time he had left. That was a really hard thing to keep up with him. But we eventually, you know, we've settled on something that worked enough for him, because Scott Blevins, the guy that runs it, he even produces one from strains that are more uplifting. So it's got all the medicine, but it's not as sedating. So we kind of combined it with those. And anyway, as 2 weeks later, his first PSA test after taking his protocols, the levels had already dipped, and he hadn't started his hormone treatment yet. And then the next then he did his hormone treatment, which he was supposed to continue for 13 months. He could only stand up for 3. His PSA levels dropped again, and then they were saying, "You're not going to die from this. This is basically gone." He did a round of radiation just to make sure, and now he's just taking the capsules, and he doesn't have cancer. It's pretty crazy.
What have you? That's amazing. Yeah, like
I
what
know.
kind of stuff have you seen in the literature that helps with this? Like, I assume you've done some digging.
I mean, what I've seen is it. No, I'll be honest. I haven't done a ton of research on cancer treatment because like, what I can find is difficult for somebody like me to read. And it's talking about, well, it does this to this kinase or destroys these kinds of cells, or it's not a, these patients were treated with this amount of cannabis for this long, and this is what happened to their cancer. I don't know of any of those kinds of trials. Do you? Not human ones.
Not offhand, right? Like I've heard of a lot of in vitro stuff, but I've never really heard of human trials.
And rats. They've done it to rats and mice plenty, but
have you seen
this
the movie
is the thing that blows my mind. Yeah. Huh?
Dosed 2, the film. It's like a Canadian film team, I think out of Vancouver, and they did Dosed 1, and it was somebody that recovered from some pretty intense kind of I think opioid use disorder, and then the second one was a lady that had a pretty serious terminal diagnosis, cancer diagnosis, I think metastatic, and they were doing hardcore RSO in there and also psilocybin. And I know of one Netherlands-based in vitro psilocybin cannabis study, but it was, in vitro, right? But this was a real person doing it, and yes, she started sleeping a lot. And at a certain point, I was like, I wish I could sleep that much. It'd be amazing.
Right. But and I don't like safety and efficacy, or safety at least is established for cannabis. I don't understand why there aren't human trials here. I just don't really get it.
It's the feds like getting in the way of like regulated work. But anyway, like total remission by the end of the movie. From what I recall, everybody should see the movie anyway.
Yeah. You said Dosed
2.
2.
And beautiful film. Yeah. I really like those guys. I think they're starting up like a little bit of a school soon, which is great.
I know Weed the People is another good one about pediatric cancer treatment with Bonnie Goldstein, that features this girl from Pennsylvania, ocular glioblastoma, which wasn't fatal but would make her blind, and the only treatments were like these harsh chemo treatments derived in the 60s, and they gave her RSO up to like a gram a day or something like that, and so her side effects from cancer treatment were giggling and sleeping on the couch. And
it's tough.
Total remission. Too much time. But then it's cool because they show some other. It's not cool, but it's balanced in that they show some other cases where some kids, their life's extended, but they don't quite make it.
Yeah, like that's something that we should just recognize, right? Like it's not the case that this is going to work for everybody. It's not the case that we have really great literature here proving this. That said, like there's endless stories about this though that we can go, and often this stuff does not interfere with your traditional treatments you're doing, and it could be very complementary. I'm sure you're familiar with Paul Stamets' famous kind of like turkey tail story with his mother, and that's I've seen him cry multiple times telling that story, and it's always amazing.
Yep.
And the idea that using things to complement the traditional therapies is like a good idea and like potentially safe. I think that would be something to explore with some research. Actually, like let's establish that this is workable and at the very least safe enough.
Yeah.
If not, helping.
Well, they did some early studies too. Like I remember, at least with like side effects of chemo and radiation. But what I don't remember seeing is if they tracked outcomes from the people that used it versus not. Right, that would be really interesting. Were they using it enough? Right, but it's just there's not enough being done there. It's there's so many stories, but we haven't cracked the code yet. And that's a big part of what I talk about is cannabis doesn't really cure anything. It supports your body in it to push its own processes.
Right. Um, right. I've been kind of peripherally involved with Colorado's medical and recreational cannabis world since maybe 2014 when it became state level legal
Mhm.
for kind of the rec adult use. And it was interesting to watch all these folks come in, effectively medical refugees coming to Colorado to be able to access
Right.
services
The
and
whole
product.
Charlotte Web stuff. Yeah.
Right, like the Charlotte Web thing. Like I remember stories of Alzheimer's patients coming in and they would get patches, like transdermal
Mhm.
patches, and then they would be able to actually hold their granddaughter, which
Right.
is really interesting and beautiful. Um, and
Yeah, one of the early calls I got when I started advertising was this lady in Ohio, and she's like, "I'm retired. I'm not coming to your talk, but my husband has Alzheimer's. He's been doing great with CBD. I broke my arm, and so now Human Services won't let him live with me until my arm is healed. He's in a home. They put him on risperidol, take him off the CBD, and he's tanking. What do I do?" I was like, I don't know. Maybe call a lawyer, talk about continuity of care. Like, that's really awful. I'm so sorry.
mm, mm,
Um, yeah.
yeah, after did New Orleans get hit twice since Katrina? Like we had this big influx of folks here in Colorado post Katrina, and also like, um,
There was another one. I'm not good with hurricane names.
yeah, I don't recall offhand, but a lot of folks moved here from Louisiana post that also for, yeah, seizure disorder for their children,
Hmm.
because they just couldn't get it. It was like fascinating to watch, and I actually wonder, David, like how that might shake out with these regulated access models in Oregon and Colorado around psilocybin mushrooms. And
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
don't know that people are going to move here for it, but they could.
Well, I could. Is it not available to out of state residents?
Oh, it's definitely available to out of state residents.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But what's the price point too? That might be a big thing. I mean, a
A
bottle of CBD
little
was a
too
lot.
much money.
Yeah, a bottle of CBD is a lot
Um,
less than $10,000 back then.
yeah.
Even back then.
So, like, street prices on mushrooms, like I see anything from like $3 for 3 grams to like $100 for three
Right.
grams, depending on like the boutique nature of it,
Hmm.
or just the more democratic nature of it,
Hmm.
and how illegal it is in your municipality, state, whatever. But here in Colorado, it's like pretty available almost
So
everywhere.
are there a lot of therapists kind of using the gray area of the law of like sort of like the idea of like, well, my client came in dosed on psilocybin, so I'm ethically required to support them through that experience. Is it?
That's an argument that some make. This is happening, and I think it's happening more in other parts of the country that way.
Hmm.
I think it's a little more relaxed here, though they could still lose their license for doing it.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, we have a pretty robust kind of uh, shift in laws. So like people aren't going to be criminalized for this stuff. It's more of like a decriminalized thing where you might get some sort of lighter penalty. Um, but it's going to be curious to see how it all gets rolled out.
Hmm.
Yeah. I one of the big there was hopefully the last hearing with the state today. We're supposed to get final rules like late December, and they're way off. But in the final hearing, it seems like things are kind of getting close to being finished. But people can't necessarily be administered to at their homes inside the
Right.
regulated model, unless there's certain criteria they meet, like
Hmm.
homebound kind of like designation. I'm
Hmm.
like, that's a
Hmm.
little, it's a little much, a little discriminatory. Like,
Yeah.
what if somebody's just over that threshold,
Yeah. Yeah.
and still
I mean,
disabled?
yeah. I mean, the whole set and setting, and all of it's very fascinating to me because it's all about setting up and creating this container to give people context to process their experience. And that's going
Mm-hmm.
to be so individualized. It's funny to me that we have these trials where everybody goes in the same room in a hospital and you can't leave that room for 6 to 8 hours. Um, and trapped in the room with one other person, maybe two other people. It's so unlike the way we traditionally use
And the
psychedelics.
results are good, which is
Yeah,
the
and they're
best.
still
Like,
good, right? Right. It's fascinating. It's really
yeah,
fascinating.
I find that like hilarious. Like, okay, let's come to one of the most notorious psychiatric hospitals in America and do a bunch of mushrooms with these
Yeah, I
people.
can't imagine a more unpleasant way to pass the time on mushrooms, honestly, than stuck in one room with strangers.
Yeah, yeah, but it's good results, right?
Yeah, that's
So
what I'm saying.
like,
It's amazing.
so weird, and yeah, so I'm trying to think if there was more on cannabis we wanted to touch, or if we jump to psychedelics.
Well,
Um,
I
mhm,
think that there's a lot of room to be discovered there, which is part of,
mhm,
some of the work that I hope the company involved with Standard Seeds Corporation that we'll eventually uncover, because a big part of what we're doing is deeply exploring all the receptor binding affinity to all the different chemicals in cannabis, not just the cannabinoids, but all the non-cannabinoid constituents. Because, like, for example, sterols are preserved in cannabis smoke, but like flavonoids aren't, right? So there's going to be a difference between a whole plant consuming it when at the temperatures, because there's so many variables in the routes of administration and the way that cannabis can be processed, that there's this very strong relationship between the CB1 and the 5-H2A receptor that's not well understood. That guy that you had on a few weeks ago talking about the different terpenes in cannabis that might elicit more of a psychedelic reaction. That there's in some of the companies we've been talking about, there's a lot of sort of hard science that would help support those claims, but it
mm,
seems so idiosyncratic too at the same time. Where I've talked to growers, they'll say, this strain had a completely psychedelic reaction to one person. Next person next to them spoke the exact same amount, totally different experience. And so I think that there's a lot of work to be done to explore that relationship, because I think cannabis, properly administered to the right people, it certainly wouldn't work for everybody, but it could be a very effective and far safer, gentler psychedelic treatment.
mm, mhm. Yeah, I know of one group doing some uh, psychotherapy supported by cannabis. I find that really fascinating.
Yeah,
In a clinic, in a real deal clinic too,
that's
which is
interesting. Yeah,
edgy, but I like it.
yeah,
And
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
they're who is that? It's Daniel McQueen in Boulder. I think they're also doing psilocybin treatments there, which is wild too. In clinic, the legal structure has to be such that it works, but
Mm-hmm.
there's arguments to be made that you can make that work.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Mhm. Um, so what what were you being told by some of these like pharma people that you got to meet that we were chatting about before, around like why are we not seeing action around these
Um,
drugs?
because regulation. So but I also feel like there's a bit of a scapegoating there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because money has tended to grease the wheels of regulators over the years. I'm sure if somebody wanted to grease those wheels, they could be greased. I mean, we've gotten far more dangerous drugs approved, but that's a big part of it. And because like at this conference, for example, there was a lot of emphasis on compounds that would or cannabinoids that binded to CB2 but not CB1, or looking for more selective binding to CB2. And what's hard with me about that is a couple things. One is, and we've seen this particularly with cannabinoids, right? So if we look at the spice K2 potpourri kind of mess that happened a few years back, which um, all but disappeared as states legalized cannabis, right? Because it's only existed because people like cannabis. And then here are these chemicals that are legal and feel exactly like cannabis at first. I don't know if you ever tried any of them, but the early ones felt basically exactly the same, but would only last like 20, 30 minutes. So in some
Mm-hmm.
ways, it's like, this is actually sort of convenient. Um, but then that would become illegal. And so they have to tweak the formula. And as they tweak the formula, it becomes more and more selective. And then the more selective a drug becomes, the more dangerous it becomes. And we see this
Mm-hmm.
with opioids. We see this with with benzo. So like Valium is safer than Xanax. That's because it's a non-selective GABA agonist, whereas Xanax is GABA A, right, specifically. And so it just creates a stronger withdrawal syndrome. And so the more selective you make a drug, the more risk it seems to have. And so this weird argument of trying to make cannabinoids more selective when we've already seen this be very dangerous for people. And so, this sort of trying to be more selective for CB2 seems like a weird way to go, because the whole reason we're investigating cannabis is because of its safety profile, the way that it is. And I think that's got a lot to do with its non-selectivity. It activates a lot of different things in a way that we're like, if you're super well rested and you use some cannabis, you might get a lot of energy. If you're super sleep deprived and you use cannabis, you're probably gonna get very sleepy, because it is a dampening. It's a tool that dampens neurotransmitters, right? So it kind of, when it lowers one thing, it might kind of raise the level of another thing. And so it's just this, the more selective we make them, and more predictable an effect might be, but the less predictable the side effects might end up being, or the more side effects you might get. And so there's a lot of talk about that, like CBN for sleep, for example. But then as they talk about it more, they say, well, you take it 2 to 3 hours before bed. And I was like, well, is there a metabolite? And he's like, yeah, there's. And is that a CB1 agonist? Yeah. And so then really what you're talking about is you got to get the dosage up high enough to activate the CB1. That's what makes people sleepy, probably. And so it's just this, they keep trying to take this square peg of cannabis and shove it in the round hole of our pharmaceutical pipeline. And every time they do it, just kind of, what I like is it disrupts and highlights problems in the system. Because here we have a safe drug, but when we try to make it like every other drug, it becomes less safe, right? But then we can't test it like we do every other drug because it's got so much stuff in it that it's hard to predict. But that's just because, but if we're just looking at outcomes and safety, then it is easy to predict. I don't really understand sometimes how we got in this mess of we have to have placebo-controlled double-blind studies for everything of one chemical and one disease when none of us operates that way. And it just sort of, we just get so in the weeds of things that we miss opportunities. Like modafinil for ADHD is one of my favorite cases. Do you know why that's not recommended for ADHD? Because in the trials, it worked remarkably well with adults, but one 13-year-old kid, I think, died. It's not good. It's terrible. So we shouldn't prescribe to kids, but it was great for adults. And it's prescribed massively off-label for ADHD, and people really like it. But that kind of thing where I'm not saying we shouldn't take death seriously in drug trials, but the idea that we then ignore that for that whole population, right? Because of that one thing that exists. So just kind of like, the psychosis with cannabis in young people. One of my favorite ideas, because yes, that correlation is strong. And we see that people that have that difficulty, when they attenuate their cannabis use, their symptoms go down, right? So they're definitely related. And THC is dopaminergic. It all makes sense. But I was just verifying it today. There's a study that shows that kids that didn't stop taking cannabis and didn't enter treatment with antipsychotics did better and required less treatment. And I don't think that's got to do with cannabis being helpful for psychosis. I think that's got to do with antipsychotics not being good for young people. In early stages of psychosis or prodromal stages that we might jump in a bit too early with that kind of treatment, right? Where because studies also then show that social connections at that age are much more effective in maintaining wellness as well, right? So it just gets very, very complicated when we start to.
There were some headlines recently. You saw that I think one of the major medical journals published a full-on psychedelic episode somewhat recently, issue of their journal. I forget which journal it was. If somebody knows, please throw it in the comments there for us. And then I saw a bunch of action this morning on X, and people were this one physician was talking about how he's kind of writing an analysis of why psychedelics need to be treated like traditional medications in the drug development pipeline. And he's calling it psychedelic exceptionalism in like the drug pipeline
Mm-hmm.
discussion, which on one hand I get,
Mm-hmm.
like, yes, we should be following the rules. On the other hand, like, what new drug has decades of data behind it as it hits the FDA?
Right.
Like that
Right.
that is to me like the
Or
best argument.
centuries or millennia.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Um, but some researchers, some physicians have like very particular rules of evidence, which I get, but also I think that there's certain kinds of biases like race bias and more,
Mm-hmm.
colonial bias. Like you
Yeah,
don't like
and just
that.
this idea that there must be a discrete answer that fits everybody, if not most people. So like I always get questions about dosing with cannabis, and that's like there is no standard dose, and that's one of the greatest benefits. That's the fact of all medications, is why we have different dosages, right? But there
Mm-hmm.
are the therapeutic windows for a lot of our chemical pharmaceuticals are very narrow, and so this is
Mm-hmm.
one of the advantages of cannabis is you just go way out on the dosage, right, and really experiment with that. Um, I'm sorry, I forgot what you were started there with.
We're talking about kind of like drug exceptionalism and
Right,
like in the drug
and then
development frame.
with psychedelics, the failure original this first failure with the FDA and MDMA around this inability to extricate it from the psychotherapy, right? Because there is no standardized methodology for psychotherapy. The FDA doesn't regulate that, and so I understand why MAPS did their study the way they did, where they did like people with therapy and people with therapy and the drug. It would, I think, a treatment as usual group would have also really benefited them to highlight the difference, because the improvement was so great with this form of therapy that almost nobody gets, right? Having
Mm-hmm.
they still had over 60% remission with just the two therapists in the room at that great length of time doing this kind of explorative therapy. That in some ways the study is more of a testament to the therapy than it is to the drug in some ways. Does that make sense? But that there's this
Right.
problem that we can't fully extricate it, because if you don't give people a container and a context, the risk of adverse events goes way up. You know, like if
Mm-hmm.
you properly frame it, even an adverse event can end up being a beneficial session.
Yeah.
And
Um,
so I think that's the difficulty I have, is that we're getting into a realm where you can't measure in the way that we measure.
how about financial incentives, right? Like the idea that like ketamine is probably a good use case here as an example to say like, okay, why is this only available off label for anesthesia? And it's
Oh,
it's money.
yeah.
And like the data is pretty good. Every data point, like
Hmm.
research I've seen on ketamine assisted psychotherapy is really
Yeah.
great. And
Yeah.
it's expensive to bring something through the FDA. And
Yeah, well, and I think it's a great example. Like ketamine is not approved for depression. Esketamine is, or Spravato is approved, right? And that's considered a different thing, right? And that because racemic ketamine is off patent, right? So, but then
mm-hmm.
the way the patenting works in the drug world, which I've learned a lot about in this biotech startup, is that like, but then in this country we can patent method of treatment. So you may not be able to patent a natural compound, but you can patent its application to a certain condition.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something you're starting to see with racemic ketamine, where they're pairing it with this therapy and this therapy to treat PTSD or to treat this or acute suicidality. And so you're seeing some of those things. But same thing with MDMA. MDMA was never going to be approved. MDMA therapy was going to be approved, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's the same thing with CBD. CBD is not FDA approved. Every company selling CBD is actually breaking federal law. So they brought up in that conference, and they're all like, yeah. It's even the guys selling CBN. They're technically breaking federal law because it's not approved for human consumption. But
Mm.
Epidiolex is,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's just this
Yeah.
weird name brand thing that we get going on. So yeah,
Yeah.
financial incentives are a huge part of it. It's
Right.
and I
And there's
that's
like
a big
no
part of what's going on with
exclusivity over a
cannabis.
molecule if
Hmm.
unless you are the one that developed this novel molecule, which probably makes sense around these like Gen 2, Gen 3 discussions around
Mm-hmm.
like oh, they're going to be way better, and we're going to remove the trip and it's going to be better, which
Right.
is
Right.
not necessarily true for all conditions and all
Yep.
people.
Yep.
Though I'm happy to have trip-free drugs available
Mhm.
um in the future.
Was it Rick Doblin has that story about bromo LSD and like
I think
and some
so.
some Middle Eastern sovereign who wanted to treat migraines for his son, and they were like, "Yeah, we don't think it's gonna work," and then it did, but they had to give him like massive doses, like
So
in the
this is a really
milligrams
interesting
of
discussion.
bromo
So
LSD versus regular LSD, which
yeah, there's so we covered a group in our TV show we did a bunch of years ago, Psychedelics Tonight. They were the ones who acquired the rights for it, this
mm.
molecule, I believe, and particularly with interest to um, cluster headaches.
Yeah, that's a
And
cluster headaches, not
and it
Michael's
was
cluster. Yeah.
not it was not necessarily the case that they would eat a gram, but you could eat a gram of this LSD derivative and get clinical effect, but have no psychoactive effect.
Yeah.
And so the higher doses were to get like better saturation faster.
Mhm.
And I think it was like 2-bromo LSD. I forget, and I totally forget the name of the company at this point. But
Mhm.
it was a really interesting story. If people like this kind of headache
Yeah.
discussion, the recent book "Psychedelic Outlaws" by Joanna Kempner is really great. She's out of Rutgers and
Nice.
does kind of like
Nice.
medical anthropology.
Yeah.
Um,
And there's an
and
organization I remember I met them at Psychedelic Science in 2020, Cluster Busters.
yeah,
Um,
we're friendly with those
actually
guys. They're
put
amazing.
out they put out a protocol for folks too. Yeah. I had a client who had chronic daily migraines, like woke up with them, went to bed with them, and was on all the measures totally healthy, like did all the things they're supposed to do, could not get rid of these things. Cannabis had some effectiveness, but only at uncomfortably high doses. And that was the next step for her, was to start to look
Hmm.
into microdosing. But yeah, she tried
Yeah.
everything else.
So that's the Psychedelic Outlaws book kind of is the history of cluster busters, and it's
Mm. Hmm.
extraordinary. It's a somewhat new
Yeah, that's
book.
really cool.
It gets into
Nice.
their, deep, twisty,
Oh,
turny
nice.
history, a lot of funny interactions with maps and other kind of like interesting folks in the psychedelic space.
I love that. That's really
Dr.
cool.
John Halpern, there's a lot of fun stories about him in
Nice.
there. And then yeah, it's so good. So like this is a really good example of a citizen group that said, "Hey, we have a problem.
Hmm.
Nobody's really developing a drug for us. Like they did try, but it didn't work so great. So what do we do?" So they just had a number of accidents and said, and they were sharing all online because they're just on these forums, kind of like
Yeah.
for the young kids, like Discord, but different.
Yeah.
And it's just funny to say.
Yeah. And
But
there's such a movement towards
mhm.
people trying to find ways to help themselves rather than turning to the established channels, which I think is a mixed bag. I think there's a lot of good to come out of that, but I think that the erosion of trust is also risky.
Mhm. Right. Um, yeah, that's a thing I was thinking about this morning actually, was how do we do this trust in government thing in today's era? Because we do need to trust the FDA.
Yeah.
We do need to trust regulatory authorities with our safety. And we do every
Mhm.
single day, right? Like I'm eating this ibuprofen. I'm like, is this going to be poison or not? Odds
Yeah.
are low. But like
I,
at what point does trust go away and how do we get that back?
yeah, I think most people, most regulators are good people and they're operating on the knowledge that they have. And so I think education is so important to push forward. And again, that's a big part of what we're trying to do at Standard C Corporation, is really create a high level standard of education for all the different kind of professions that touch this industry. Because cannabis is really fascinating in that it's a new industry. It's not like you name a realm of work or industry, and there's a way that role can be connected to cannabis. There's production, construction, There's machine makings, all the medicine stuff. There's just it's totally endless. It's a new class of drug.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Um, so what are you really excited about in like the next couple years related to cannabis or psychedelic medicine?
Well, what I'm excited to see happen is and what there was a lot of talk about in the conference in Boston was accelerated
Mm-hmm.
development and
Mm-hmm.
not being afraid of looking at natural plant compounds. There is a path for plant compounds to be FDA approved. It's called the botanical drug path. But when you ask people why they don't do it, they go, "Well, it's really hard. It's a lot of work. It's really hard." And that's the answer to a lot of things where you say like, "Well, the solution would be like this," and then you're met with, "Well, but yeah, that's like really expensive. That's a lot of work, but it's
Mm-hmm.
the right thing to do." So I don't. What's the point?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm excited that there's a lot of movement in that. It seems like there's this window open where some companies are very thirsty for real depth knowledge to take advantage of the power of the plant rather than take sort of extract something from the plant and try to put it into a pipeline, but to see what it does and then to see what it might be best for them.
Yeah. I'm
And I
aware
think
of
sorry, go ahead.
I'm aware of this one biotech. Oh man, I'm forgetting their name. I think Cacti, maybe. Caitlin
Mm,
Robinson is, I think, the executive there. Really smart people behind it, and they're using like advanced AI kind of mouse models to find
mm,
not
mhm.
just like on-off like head twitch stuff, but like
Yeah.
far more sophisticated data per mouse, which is fascinating. And like at what that does to like drug development speed and drug like new molecule discovery is fascinating to me.
Yes. So, like with Standard Seed Corporation, what we predict is that we can produce for at least one chemical, we could produce a preclinical report in likely 6 months, maybe less, which
Mm-hmm.
is remarkably fast. When the average timeline for to get to trials is up to 2 to 6 years.
Mm.
That really starts to create speed. And then if you're looking at compounds that have already been studied, you can do that then you can jump over the animal models sometimes if you're looking at a new condition. So, like for example, here's a free one for the pharmaceutical industry for anybody that's listening. As I told you, if those of you who Google Lyme disease and cannabis, go ahead and Google it. You'll find every dispensary and every Lyme disease blog suggesting these two go together. And you put it into PubMed, you'll find two references, none of which are studying people with Lyme disease taking cannabis. I've examined some data. I'm the only one that I know this in an official way. So I'm also looking for academic partners there. I've got a good database. But dronabinol is a existing pharmaceutical drug. It is THC. And in my findings of the data, what was really surprising was THC. I thought I'd find mixed ratios in CBD more beneficial. Across every measure I looked at, high THC got the highest scores, which was different from people who didn't have Lyme disease. And so that says a lot about the anti-inflammatory properties, the immunomodulatory properties, but there is no treatment protocol. There's no existing treatment protocol for post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. So we could easily just go to human trials with dronabinol and get really good effects and all of a sudden have a new indication for dronabinol. So there you have it, Pharma. Or if anybody else wants to talk to me about that, you feel free. But that would be remarkable. So that Johns Hopkins said it was psilocybin. I think dronabinol will
Mm-hmm.
probably be more effective over time.
Yeah. Does let's see. Final question from
Or
somebody
even
watching
Sativex
YouTube.
or sorry. Yeah, please.
Yeah, all good. Somebody's suggesting that contemporary medicine does not believe Lyme is real. I don't know if that's true, right? Because you can like test for the
Oh,
antibodies.
yeah, they
Um,
believe it's real. It's the chronic nature that is dismissed a lot.
mm-hmm.
And that's the part that's we could do a whole day on that if you want. It's very complicated.
Yeah.
They believe it exists. It's the chronic nature that is often dismissed, but it's very real.
Yeah. Right on. Cool. Well, where can people find more about your work and what you're up to?
You can find me on LinkedIn. And that's the best place to find me right now. I had a website up, but it's been the hosting people have been problematic, so I'm trying to get that redone. But on LinkedIn is the best place to search me, David Aronson, LCSW. I'm posting a lot, always putting up my talks. If you live in the states where I advertise and you're a mental health professional, you're definitely going to be getting my emails for sure. And eventually we're going to be trying to just push out more and more states. I'll be doing monthly talks. People can email me at draronsonlcsw@gmail. They can write to me on LinkedIn, whatever. Yeah, I'm around.
Amazing.
If you search cannabis in my name, you'll find me. And they can find my talks on pre-recorded talks on Pessy. And again, I'll be making regular announcements for my talks coming up.
Outstanding. David, thanks so much for being here, and I hope we get to do more.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I look forward to talking to you a lot more in the future. Take care.
Thanks.